The wind came first. It rolled down from the low red hills and swept across the valley like a living thing, dragging dust and dry grass with it, rattling the loose boards of the market pens and whispering through the gaps in every fence it touched. In this country, the wind was never just weather. It was a warning. Skye Redding walked beside Trace Voss with her head slightly bowed, her long dark hair braided tight against the grit in the air. Her skin was sun-browned, her clothes simple, soft leather, faded cloth, stitched and mended more than once. Everything she carried had a purpose. Nothing was for show. Trace talked as he walked, his voice smooth as oiled rope. Prices, deals, names of men who might need a hand, a girl who could cook, clean, translate, or just work without asking too many questions. Skye listened, but her eyes were on the ground, on the way the dust curled around her boots, on the tracks of hooves and wagon wheels crossing each other like stories that never stayed in one place. They had come to the livestock market for one reason: food. Her family needed flour, dried beans, salt. Hawk Redding had stretched the last sack of cornmeal as far as it could go. Elna Redding's hands were careful now, measuring every scoop as if it were gold. Lynn Redding still believed hunger could be chased away by laughter. Skye knew better. Hunger stayed. You learned to live beside it. By the time they reached the outer edge of Mercer Ranch, the heat had settled into her bones. The wind kept blowing, but it didn't cool anything. It only dried her throat and made her steps heavier. The fence stood tall and straight, built from thick posts sunk deep into the earth. Beyond it, cattle shifted in slow, dark waves. Men on horseback moved like shadows along the line, calling out numbers, marking tallies. Skye stopped. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. The world tilted, just for a moment. She stepped toward the fence and rested her hand on the rough wood, breathing in dust and sun and the faint, warm smell of animals. That was when she leaned back. Her shoulder touched something solid, not wood, not air. A man. Rook Calder had been counting. He stood just inside the fence, a ledger tucked under one arm, his eyes on the herd as it pressed and turned in the pen. His coat was dark, worn at the edges, his hat pulled low against the sun. He carried himself like the land, quiet, steady, unmovable. When Skye's weight settled against him, he stiffened. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The wind pushed between them, tugging at her braid, brushing the hem of his coat. Skye turned startled, her hand lifting as if to steady herself. Their eyes met. Rook saw dust on her lashes. He saw the tight line of her mouth, the way she held herself upright even when she was clearly tired. He saw no fear there, no pleading, just a kind of calm that came from knowing how to endure. Skye saw a man carved by seasons. His face was lined, not with age, but with weather and long days and longer nights. His eyes were pale, watchful, like water that ran deep and cold. Around them, the market slowed. Dusty Reed paused outside his store. A pair of cowhands leaned on a rail, their voices dropping. Somewhere near the church, Preacher Holt stopped mid-sentence. In this place, a woman leaning against a man like that meant something. Protection, claim, a line drawn in the dirt. Trace Voss took a step back, suddenly very interested in the ground. Rook felt the weight of the looks before he heard them. He could have stepped away, could have cleared his throat, tipped his hat, turned it into nothing. He didn't. Instead, he stayed where he was. Skye straightened, pulling back just enough to stand on her own. But she didn't move away. Her eyes held his, steady as the horizon. Rook closed his ledger. "Wind's got teeth today," he said, his voice low, roughened by dust and years of saying only what needed to be said. Skye nodded. "It always does." A simple answer, a true one. He noticed then the way her hands were empty. No bag, no basket. Nothing but a thin cord tied around her wrist, worn smooth by touch. "What brings you to my fence?" Rook asked. "Food," she said, no shame in the word. No softness either. Work if there is any. The wind surged again, lifting dust into the space between them. Rook looked past her, toward the distant line of low hills where the land changed color and meaning. For a moment, he saw not a stranger, not a problem, not a rumor waiting to be born. He saw water where there was none. He saw ground that remembered every footstep ever taken across it. "Name?" he asked. "Skye Redding." He tipped his hat just slightly. Rook called her. Around them, the whispers began to move, light and fast as sparks in dry grass. Rook heard them. Skye felt them. Neither of them stepped away. And in that quiet space beside the fence, with dust in the air and wind in their ears, something settled between them. Small, unseen, and dangerous as a seed before the rain. By morning, the wind had carried more than dust. It carried names. The first place the rumor landed was Dusty Reed's store, where sacks of flour leaned against the wall and jars of coffee beans sat behind a counter, worn smooth by 100 restless hands. A pair of ranch hands stood near the door, boots planted wide, voices low but eager. "Rook Calder," one of them said, like the name itself was a spark. "Heard he's taken in an Apache girl." Dusty Reed didn't look up from his scale. He let the weight settle, let the beam dip and rise. "I heard she leaned on him by the fence," he said. "That's not nothing out here." By the time the bell on the door rang again, the story had already grown a spine. It had posture now. It walked. Down the street, the boards of the wooden walkway creaked under boots and skirts. The saloon doors swung open and shut, carrying laughter and the smell of whiskey into the sun. Inside, men leaned close over their glasses, shaping the tale with their mouths. "She's after his land. He's gone soft. Maybe he's just lonely." Every version sounded truer than the last, depending on who told it. At the far end of town, the small white church stood quiet, its door open to the breeze. Preacher Holt stood at the pulpit, his Bible open, his voice steady and careful. "Order," he said, "is what keeps this valley standing. Without it, we're just a scatter of fences and fears." Some of the heads in the pews nodded. Some turned just slightly toward the door, toward the street where the rumor walked. Behind the last row, Vern Black sat with his hands folded, his face calm as still water. He did not nod. He did not look toward the door. His mind was already elsewhere. Mercer Valley, land that stretched wide and open, grass that stayed green longer than it should, a ranch that didn't bend to anyone's will. If Rook Calder stumbled, Vern Black would be there to catch the fall, with papers, with promises, with a ring for his daughter. Belle Black waited outside the church, her dress pale against the dust, her posture straight as a fence post. She watched the street, the passing faces, the way some of them looked at her with expectation instead of curiosity. She had always known what her place was supposed to be. Across town, Sky Redding felt the shift before she heard the words. Women at the well stopped talking when she stepped close. A man outside the saloon tipped his hat, not in respect, but in something that felt like measurement. Even Trace Voss kept his distance now, his easy smile replaced with a careful one. Sky carried a small sack of flour back toward the edge of town, her shoulders square, her steps even. She had walked through worse than this. She had crossed land where looks were harder than stones. Still, the weight of it pressed against her ribs. "Girl like you shouldn't be standing where you stood," someone muttered as she passed. Sky did not turn. The wind tugged at her braid. She let it. At Mercer Ranch, Rook Calder found Sheriff Cole waiting by the gate. The sheriff leaned on his horse, hat tipped back, eyes shaded. "Town's talking," he said. "You know how that goes." Rook rested his hands on the top rail of the fence. The wood was warm under his palms. "Town always talks. Not like this." Sheriff Cole straightened. "Vern Black's got plans. Preacher Holt's got concerns. Folks want things to stay the way they understand them." Rook looked out over his land. The cattle shifted, slow and steady, unaware of names or lines drawn in dust. "Land doesn't care what folks understand," he said. "It just stays." The sheriff studied him. "Peace comes from knowing which battles to leave alone, or which ones not to," Rook answered. That evening, June Calder came down from the main house, her skirts brushing the porch steps. She had Rook's eyes, though hers were softer, more inclined to worry than to watch. "You don't see it," she said, not unkindly. "But they do. They see a line being crossed. They see you stepping out of place." Rook set his hat on the railing. "And what do you see?" June hesitated. "I see a town that will make this harder than it needs to be. And a girl who's going to carry the weight of it first." Rook said nothing. Across the valley, Sky sat near a low fire with her family. Hawk Redding watched the horizon like it might answer him. Elna Redding broke bread into careful pieces. Lynn Redding traced shapes in the dirt, half listening, half dreaming. The wind moved through the grass, through the trees, through the spaces between words. Sky looked toward the distant lights of Mercer Valley, faint and scattered like stars that had fallen to the ground. Somewhere between the town and the open land, between rumor and truth, between what was expected and what was felt, Two people stood on opposite sides of the same storm, and the wind, restless and patient, kept pulling them toward its center. The dust hadn't settled since morning. It hung in the air like a second sky, thin and pale, turning the sun into a dull coin above Mercer Valley. Rook Calder stood on the porch of the main house and watched the land breathe. The cattle shifted in the far pen. The wind dragged its fingers through the grass. Somewhere beyond the hills, a storm might have been thinking about being born. Sky Redding waited at the bottom of the steps. She did not look up at the house. She looked at the ground between them, the space where dirt met shadow. That was how things were decided out here. Not in rooms, not on paper, but in open air where nothing could hide. Rook walked down to her, his boots slow, deliberate. He stopped close enough to speak without raising his voice. "Town's got a story now," he said. Sky nodded. "Stories don't need permission." "No," Rook agreed, "but they do need a place to land." The wind moved between them. Sky lifted her chin. "I won't be your shield if that's what you're asking." Rook studied her face. The sun had marked her cheeks. The road had hardened her eyes. There was nothing soft about the way she stood, nothing that suggested she was waiting to be saved. "I'm not offering shelter," he said. "I'm offering ground." She frowned just slightly. "Stay here," Rook went on. "Not as a favor, not as a rumor, as part of the ranch." Sky folded her arms. "Doing what?" "Whatever keeps this place standing," he said. "You cook. You keep the books straight when I'm dealing with men who don't like numbers. You talk when I need words that don't belong to me." She thought of her father's quiet watch over the hills, of her mother's careful hands measuring grain, of Lynn's laughter that tried to fill empty space. "And in return?" Sky asked. Rook didn't look away. "I make sure no one touches your land, your family. Anyone who comes looking to trade flesh for paper or water for signatures, they come through me first." Sky felt the weight of that. Protection was never free in this country. It always asked for something back. She stepped closer, close enough to see the scar near his jaw, thin and white against weathered skin. "I have condition," she said. Rook waited. "Hawk Redding," Sky began. "Elna Redding, Lynn Redding. They eat first. They get medicine when they need it, not when it's convenient." Rook nodded once. "When I leave," as she went on, "I don't leave empty-handed. I don't leave with a story someone else tells about me. I leave with a path of my own choosing." Rook's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in recognition. "You don't plan on staying." "I plan on surviving," Sky said. "Those aren't the same thing." There was a long moment where neither of them spoke. The land seemed to lean in, listening. "And Belle Black?" Sky added, her voice steady even. "If you decide she's your future, this ends. That day." Rook felt the name settle like a stone in his chest. He looked past Sky, toward the line of cottonwoods along the dry creek bed, toward a future that had already been laid out for him by other men. "This isn't about her," he said. "It will be," Sky replied. "Everything always is." The wind picked up, lifting dust around their boots. Rook reached out and brushed it away from the space between them, a small, unconscious motion. "No paper," he said. "No witnesses." Sky's mouth curved just barely. "Good. Paper lies. People forget." Rook extended his hand. It was rough, scarred, the hand of a man who built things and broke them and built them again. Sky looked at it for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she took it. Her grip was firm, not small, not careful. It was the grip of someone who knew the cost of letting go. They did not smile. They did not speak. They stood there hand in hand in the open dust of Mercer Valley, while the wind carried the moment out across the land. From the porch, June Calder watched, her arms crossed against the chill that had nothing to do with weather. Near the stable, Wade Pike paused in his work, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. Gray Boone leaned on his broom, the old man's face unreadable. Across the valley at the edge of town, Vern Black stood on his own porch and felt something shift without knowing why. Sky released Rook's hand. "This doesn't make us the same," she said. Rook shook his head. "It just means we walk the same ground." She turned toward the path that led back to her family, her steps light but certain. Rook watched her go, the dust rising and falling around her like breath. He did not know what the town would say. He did not know what the land would take. He only knew that something had been set in motion that would not be called back by words. And the wind, restless and faithful, carried their unspoken pact into every fence line, every field, every waiting corner of Mercer Valley. The valley learned their footsteps before the town learned their names. Mornings came thin and pale over Mercer Valley, the light slipping across the grass like a quiet promise. Sky Redding walked the land ahead of Rook Calder, her shadow long and narrow, her eyes on the way the wind bent the tops of the weeds and stirred the dust in small, restless spirals. "Listen," she said once, stopping near a dry wash where the earth cracked like old paint. Rook tilted his head. He heard only the wind. Sky crouched, pressed her palm flat against the ground. "The sound changes," she said. "When there's water below, the wind doesn't sink as deep. It skims." Rook knelt beside her, his boots sinking into the soft edge of the wash. He felt the land the way he always had, through weight, through pressure, through the pull of fences and cattle and years of work. This was different. This was listening instead of pushing. They marked the place with a stone. Later, by the main corral, Rook unrolled a map across the hood of a wagon. The paper was worn, creased at the edges, smudged with dust and sweat. "Lines don't mean much if you don't know who's standing on them," he said. Sky traced a finger along the thin black marks, following the curve of the valley, the bend of the dry creek. "These lines decide where men argue," she said, "not where the land stops." Rook gave a short, quiet laugh. "You'll do fine in town." She shook her head. "I'll do fine here." By midday, the sun pressed down hard. Wade Pike watched from the fence as Sky moved between the kitchen door and the main house, carrying water, carrying bread, carrying ledgers Rook had left open on the table. "She's not afraid of work," Wade muttered to Gray Boone, who leaned on his broom in the shade. Gray Boone's eyes followed Sky's steady steps. "Work's not what I'm watching," he said. "I'm watching if she stays." That night, the fire burned low and steady behind the ranch house. The sky opened wide, a scatter of stars stretched across it, like something spilled and forgotten. The air cooled, but the earth still held the day's warmth. Sky sat on a log, her hands wrapped around a tin cup. Rook leaned back against a post, his hat pushed up, his gaze on the flames. "My father used to say the land remembers," Sky began. "Every footstep, every drop of blood, every seed." Rook didn't answer. He listened. "Where we come from," she went on, "there's a place where the rocks rise like old men. We leave water there for the ones who walk at night. We say their names so they don't fade." The fire popped, sending a small shower of sparks into the dark. Rook stared into the coals. "My wife died in a winter that wouldn't end," he said, his voice low, like he was speaking to the ground instead of to her. "Snow came early, stayed late. The roof caved in on the south shed. I called her name until my throat went raw." Sky felt the words settle heavy in her chest. "No one answered," Rook continued. "Not the land, not the sky." They sat with that silence, the kind that didn't need filling. A coyote called somewhere far off. The sound slid across the valley, thin and lonely. Sky set her cup down. "Where I grew up," she said, "we believe the land answers in its own time. Sometimes not to us, sometimes to the ones who come after." Rook nodded, slow. Days passed like that. They worked side by side, not close, not far. Close enough to pass a tool without looking, far enough to leave space for breath. Sky learned the weight of a brand, the sound of a fair deal. Rook learned the way clouds gathered when rain was thinking about falling. June Calder watched from the porch, worry and something softer tangled in her eyes. Wade Pike stopped asking questions. Gray Boone started setting an extra cup by the fire without a word. One evening, a storm rolled in from the west, sudden and sharp. The wind slammed the shutters. Rain came down in hard, cold lines. Sky and Rook pulled a tarp over the woodpile together, their shoulders brushing in the dark. The rain soaked through their sleeves. They laughed. Short, surprised sounds that didn't last long, but felt like something breaking loose. Inside, the fire crackled louder, the smell of wet earth and smoke filling the room. Sky stood near the door, water dripping from her hair. Rook handed her a blanket without thinking. She took it. Their eyes met, just for a moment. Nothing was said. Later, when the storm passed and the valley lay quiet again, Sky stepped outside. The ground steamed in the moonlight, the world breathing slow and deep. Rook joined her at the fence. They stood there looking out at the land that was beginning to feel less like a line between two worlds and more like a place they both belonged. Tiredness pulled at Sky's shoulders. Rook saw it and said nothing. He just stayed. Sky noticed and did the same. In the soft crackle of cooling earth and dying embers, something took root. Not loud, not bright, but steady. A feeling built from staying when it was easier to leave, from helping when no one asked, from not turning away when the dark came close. And Mercer Valley, wide and quiet under the stars, held their small, growing fire like it might one day mean something more than warmth. The smell of smoke came before the sound. Rook called or woke to it, sharp and bitter, cutting through the quiet of the ranch like a blade. He was on his feet before the thought finished forming, boots in his hands, heart already beating in the rhythm of trouble. Outside, the night was torn open by the glow of fire. One of the far sheds burned low and angry, its roof slumping in on itself as rain began to fall, heavy drops hissing when they struck the embers. Cattle bawled in the distance, a restless, frightened sound that rolled across Mercer Valley. "Wade!" Rook shouted into the dark. Sky Redding was already there, pulling on her coat, her braid loose from sleep, eyes sharp despite the suddenness of it all. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't need to. Tracks cut through the mud near the corral. Hooves, boots, fresh. "Someone drove off a small herd," Sky said, crouching, her fingers brushing the soft earth. "Not fast. Careful." Rook nodded. They didn't want noise. The rain came down harder, a cold, steady curtain that flattened dust and turned the ground slick beneath their feet. Rook grabbed a lantern. Sky took a rifle from the rack, checked it, and slung it over her shoulder. They moved out together, following the line of the creek that wound through the low ground beyond the ranch. The water ran thin but quick, swollen now by the storm, whispering over stones like it was telling secrets. The night closed in around them. Rook kept his eyes on the dark edges of the land, where brush turned into shadow and shadow turned into anything. Sky walked a few steps ahead, her body tuned to the sound of water, the shift of wind, the small signs most people missed when fear took over. Lightning split the sky, white and sudden, throwing their shapes across the wet ground. They found the stolen cattle's trail near a bend in the creek, but it faded where the rocks took over and the rain washed the prints thin. "Whoever it was knew this stretch," Rook said. Sky nodded, or had time to learn it. The rain soaked through their coats, the lantern sputtered. They took shelter under a small canvas lean-to near the creek bank, an old place used by hands during long drives. The fabric sagged with water, the edges flapping in the wind. Rook shrugged off his coat and, without thinking, draped it over Sky's shoulders. She froze for half a breath. Then she pulled it tighter around herself. They stood close in the narrow space, close enough to feel the heat of each other through wet clothes and cold air. The rain drummed on the canvas above them, a steady, patient sound. Rook could hear Sky's breathing, slow, controlled, steady like the land she always spoke of. Sky could feel his chest rise and fall, solid, grounded, a presence that didn't shift with every change in the wind. Neither of them spoke. Lightning flashed again, lighting Rook's face in sharp lines, Sky's eyes in pale reflection. For a moment, everything else, the burned shed, the missing cattle, the watching town, fell away. Sky lifted her hand, not to touch him, but to push a strand of wet hair back from her own face. Her fingers brushed his knuckles by accident. Rook didn't pull away. The space between them felt thin, fragile, like ice before it breaks. Sky looked up at him. Rook looked down at her. There were no words that fit what had grown between them in the quiet days and shared work and long nights by the fire. No promise that didn't sound too small. Rook leaned in first, slow, giving her time to turn away. She didn't. Their kiss was not gentle. It wasn't rushed either. It was a meeting. Two steady things finally touching. The kind of kiss that didn't ask, didn't explain, didn't apologize. When they pulled back, their foreheads rested together, rainwater dripping from their hair onto the ground between their boots. "This changes things," Sky said softly. Rook exhaled. It already did. They stepped out from under the canvas when the rain eased. The night cooler, cleaner, like the land had washed its face. Back at the ranch, the fire in the shed had burned itself out, leaving blackened beams and the smell of wet ash. Wade Pike stood with Gray Boone near the corral, their eyes lifting when they saw Rook and Sky walk in side by side. Wade's jaw tightened. Gray Boone's gaze lingered. From the porch, June Calder watched, her hands clasped in front of her, worry written in the line of her shoulders. Across the valley, lights flickered in the town windows. Somewhere Vern Black would hear by morning. Somewhere Preacher Holt would shape a sermon around it. Somewhere Sheriff Cole would weigh peace against truth. Sky felt the eyes before she saw them. Felt the way the night itself seemed to lean closer. Rook rested a hand on the fence. The same fence where it had all begun. Sky stood beside him, the weight of his coat still on her shoulders. From that moment on, every look would cut sharper. Every whisper would carry farther. They both knew it. Neither of them stepped away. The rain had passed, but the storm they had started was only beginning. The valley felt narrower after the rain. Not in distance, but in breadth. The air carried a tightness now, like the land itself was holding something back. Sky Redding noticed it first in the way people stopped meeting her eyes, in the way voices softened when she stepped near, and sharpened again when she passed. She walked beyond the low ridge at dawn, toward the place where the ground changed color, and the wind carried the smell of sage instead of cattle. Saul Redding waited there, his silhouette steady against the pale sky, his staff planted in the dirt like a marker between what was and what might be. "You've been walking on another man's land," he said without greeting. Sky stopped a few steps away. "I've been walking on the same ground I always have." Saul's gaze moved past her, toward Mercer Valley, where the ranch lay quiet in the early light. "That ground listens to a different law." "Rook Calder isn't the law," Sky said. Saul shook his head slow. "He carries it, whether he wants to or not." The wind passed between them, tugging at Sky's sleeve. "The people are watching," Saul went on. "They don't see a bridge. They see a line being crossed. They don't trust him, and they don't trust you anymore." Sky felt the words like stones settling in her chest. "I haven't left them." "No," Saul said, "but you're standing where they can't follow." She looked down at her hands, at the faint marks of rope and paper and fire. "I'm trying to keep something from breaking. Some things only stay whole if you let them be," Saul replied. By the time Sky turned back toward the ranch, the sun was climbing, and the valley had already begun to hum with quiet judgment. At the small white church, Preacher Holt stood in the doorway, his Bible closed in one hand, his other resting on the frame like he was holding the building in place. Rook Calder reined in his horse and looked up. "You're stirring more than dust," the preacher said. Rook dismounted, tied the reins, and faced him. "I didn't set out to." "Doesn't matter what you set out to do," Preacher Holt replied. "It matters what people see." Rook crossed his arms. "And what do they see?" "A man who's forgotten his place," the preacher said gently, "and a girl who doesn't have one here." Rook's jaw tightened. "This land doesn't belong to the town." "No," Preacher Holt agreed. "But peace does. And peace needs things to stay where folks expect them." Rook looked past the church, down the wooden street where Dusty Reed's store sat quiet, and the saloon door barely moved in the still air. "Peace that costs someone their places in peace," he said. The preacher studied him for a long moment. "You think you're strong enough to carry this alone?" "I'm not alone," Rook answered. Preacher Holt's eyes softened, just slightly. "That's what I'm afraid of." The words followed Rook back to the ranch, settling into the spaces between his thoughts. That afternoon, Vern Black arrived with 2 men and a wagon that carried more paper than supplies. He did not step down right away. He took his time, looking over the fence, the cattle, the land that refused to bow. Rook met him by the gate. Vern smiled like a man who already knew the end of the story. "Bell's patient," he said, "but patience runs out. So does goodwill." Rook said nothing. Vern leaned forward. "You marry my daughter, this valley stays quiet. You don't, and every line on every paper you've signed gets looked at twice. Every fence post gets measured. Every water right gets questioned." "That's not a choice," Rook said. "It's the only one that keeps you standing," Vern replied. Sky watched from the porch, unseen by the men at the gate. She didn't hear the words, but she saw the shape of them in the way Rook's shoulders squared, in the way Vern's smile never reached his eyes. The wind rose again, carrying dust across the yard, across Sky's boots, across the space between her and the man she had chosen. She closed her eyes and listened. Not to the town, not to the tribe, to the land. It whispered of loss and keeping, of ground taken and ground given, of what happened when people tried to hold 2 worlds in the same hands. That night, Sky packed in silence. Elna Redding's bread sat on the table, still warm. Lynn Redding slept with her hand curled around a small carved stone. Hawk Redding's shadow moved outside, restless. Sky folded Rook's coat and left it on the chair by the door. She stepped out into the dark before the moon rose, high enough to light the path. Rook found the empty space where she had stood. The porch felt larger without her. The valley felt colder. Sky walked until the ranch lights faded behind her, until the wind carried only the sound of her own steps. She did not look back. Not because she didn't want to, but because she knew if she did, she would stay. And if she stayed, the land would take from Rook what it had already decided to test. 2 worlds had turned away. Sky Redding walked into the space between them, carrying the weight of both. The caravan moved at dawn, when the sky was still pale and undecided. Wagons creaked under the weight of trade goods and tired lives, their wheels carving slow lines into the dry earth. Sky Redding walked beside the last wagon, her pack light, her steps steady. The wind carried the smell of coffee and leather and old stories that didn't belong to any one place for very long. She did not look back at Mercer Valley. Ahead of her, the road rose in a thin white ribbon, dusted with chalky soil that clung to boots and hems like memory. Every step felt like leaving something behind, even when she told herself she was only moving forward. Behind her, the valley kept breathing without her. Rook Calder stood by the fence that morning, watching the space where Sky had once stood. The cattle shifted in their pen, low and restless, as if they felt the change before he did. The land was the same. The fences were the same. The sky stretched wide and empty. And yet something was missing. He went through the motions of the day like a man moving through water. He checked the herd. He signed papers Dusty Reed brought by with a careful hand. He nodded to Sheriff Cole when the lawman rode past the gate. But every place Sky had touched felt louder in her absence. The map on the wagon hood was still rolled tight. The cup by the fire stayed where Nell Boone had set it. The stone by the dry wash still marked the place where Sky had taught him to listen for water. That afternoon, Wade Pike found Rook leaning on the corral rail, staring out at nothing in particular. "She left clean," Wade said. "Didn't stir up dust." Rook didn't answer. Wade shifted his weight. "Place feels hollow." Rook finally looked at him. Wade nodded toward the open land. "Land's still here, but it's not full. Not like it was." The words settled in Rook's chest and stayed there. 2 days later, Trace Voss rode in with the caravan smell still clinging to his coat. He stopped at the gate, his horse restless beneath him, his smile thinner than usual. "Sky's north," he said. "Trading post by the old river bend. Took work with the supply wagons, keeps to herself." Rook felt the distance like a pull in his bones. North wasn't just a direction, it was a line drawn between what he had and what he had let go. "Is she safe?" Rook asked. Trace shrugged. "As safe as anyone gets out there." That night, Rook didn't sleep. He sat by the dying fire, staring at the way the embers faded from red to gray. He thought about the first time Sky had leaned against him by the fence, about the way she had listened to the land instead of trying to own it, about the sound of her voice when she said his name, like it belonged in her mouth. He thought about Vern Black's papers, about Preacher Holt's careful warnings, about the way peace in Mercer Valley had always meant someone else paying for it. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the loose boards of the porch. Rook stood. He walked out into the open yard, boots crunching on gravel, and looked at the wide, empty stretch of land that had once felt like everything. Wade Pike stepped out of the bunkhouse, pulling on his coat. "Going somewhere?" he asked. Rook shook his head, thinking about it. Wade studied him for a long moment. Then he said, quiet and simple, "This place feels empty without her." Rook didn't argue. He saddled his horse before dawn, his movements slow, deliberate, like he was afraid of rushing into a decision the land itself had been waiting for him to make. Sky in the east began to lighten, a thin band of gold cutting through the gray. Rook mounted and rode to the edge of the valley, to the place where the fence ended and the road began. The white dust road stretched out before him, the same one Sky had taken, its surface marked with the faint memory of wagon wheels and boot prints. Rook rested his hand on the saddle horn and closed his eyes. For the first time since he had inherited Mercer Ranch, he understood something that had nothing to do with water rights or land claims or keeping the town quiet. Honor wasn't about holding ground. It was about who you chose to stand on it with. He opened his eyes. The road waited. Rook Calder turned his horse north and followed the line of white dust into the morning, leaving the valley behind him, carrying the weight of a choice that no paper could measure and no fence could hold. The bell outside Dusty Reed's store rang hard that morning, not from wind, but from a hand that wanted to be heard. Men and women drifted in from the edges of Mercer Valley, boots thudding against the wooden street, coats pulled tight against a cold that had more to do with tension than weather. The town gathered the way it always did when something was about to be decided. Not in a hall, not in a court, but in the open where everyone could see what kind of people they were. Sheriff Cole stood in the middle of the street, his hat low, his posture calm and ready, like a fence built to keep two fields from crashing into each other. On one side, Vern Black waited with his hands folded, his coat clean, his boots barely touched by dust. Belle Black stood just behind him, her face pale, her eyes fixed somewhere beyond the crowd, as if she could already see a life that was slipping away. On the other side, Rook Calder rode in slow and steady, his horse's hooves striking the boards with a sound that carried farther than any voice. He dismounted near the center of the street, tied the reins to a post, and faced the town. The murmurs began at once. Is he here to make it right? Or make it worse? Rook let the sound wash over him. He had learned in the long hours on the white dust road that noise lost its power when you didn't chase it. Vern Black stepped forward, his smile practiced, his voice smooth. We're all here because we care about this valley, he said, about keeping things steady, about making sure Mercer Ranch stays what it's always been. Rook met his eyes. And what's that? Safe, Vern replied. Predictable, in good hands. Rook glanced at Belle. She did not look back at him. Sheriff Cole cleared his throat. We're not here for speeches, he said. We're here for an answer. The crowd quieted. Rook took a breath. He felt the road still in his legs, the rhythm of hooves and distance and thought. He felt Sky's absence like a weight on his chest, steady and honest. I won't marry Belle Black, he said. The words did not rise, they did not fall, they stood. A ripple moved through the crowd. Someone cursed under their breath. Someone else laughed, sharp and surprised. Vern's smile tightened. You're choosing trouble, he said. I'm choosing truth, Rook answered. Vern took another step forward. You walk away from this, and you walk away from more than a woman. You walk away from my men, my money, my protection. Every fence you've built, every well you've dug, every paper you've signed gets looked at again. Hard. Sheriff Cole shifted, the leather of his coat creaking. Vern, he warned. Vern held up a hand. Let him hear it. Rook did hear it. He heard it in the way the crowd leaned in the way Dusty Reed's fingers tightened on the edge of his counter, in the way Preacher Holt stood at the back, his Bible held close, his face full of quiet worry. Rook looked around at the town that had watched him grow into his land, that had taken his cattle and his grain and his silence as proof of belonging. I didn't build Mercer Ranch to keep things quiet, he said. I built it to keep them right. Vern shook his head. You're trading peace for a fight you can't win. Rook rested a hand on the hitching post, steadying himself the way he always did when the ground felt like it might shift. I'm not selling my future to buy peace, he said. The words landed heavy and sure. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Belle turned away, her skirts brushing the dust as she moved back toward her father. Vern's jaw worked, his eyes dark. Sheriff Cole stepped forward, planting himself between the two men. This is where it ends, he said. Not with fists, not with guns. Rook nodded once. He untied his horse. The crowd parted as he swung into the saddle. He didn't look back at Vern. He didn't look at Belle. He didn't look at the faces that were trying to decide what he had just become. He turned his horse toward the road. The white dust stretched out beyond the town, thin and bright in the morning sun. Somewhere to the north, by a river bend and a trading post that smelled of coffee and canvas, Sky Redding was standing in a life she had chosen to protect him. Rook Calder set his heels to his horse and rode. Behind him, Mercer Valley held its breath. Ahead of him, the road opened, wide and uncertain and honest, leading him toward a future that could not be bought, bargained, or kept quiet. And for the first time since the fence, since the wind, since the moment Sky had leaned against him and changed the shape of his world, Rook felt like he was finally riding toward something that belonged to him. The high plain opened wide beneath a pale afternoon sky, the land rolling out in long, quiet lines that made a man feel small in the right kind of way. A single windpost stood near the trading station, its wooden arms creaking as they turned, pointing nowhere and everywhere at once. Rook Calder reined in his horse at the edge of the yard. The station was little more than a scatter of canvas awnings, a low building with a tin roof, and a line of wagons resting in the shade like tired animals. The air smelled of coffee grounds, sweat, and river water carried in barrels from the bend below. He saw Sky Redding before she saw him. She stood near a stack of crates, sleeves rolled, her hands darkened with dust and rope burn. Her braid hung loose over her shoulder, the end brushing against a jacket that didn't quite fit her. She was talking with a supply man, her voice calm, steady, the sound of someone who had found a rhythm in a place that didn't promise to keep her. Rook felt the road in his legs again. The miles of white dust, the nights under thin stars, the weight of a town he had left behind. Sky turned. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The wind passed between them, lifting the edge of Sky's jacket, tugging at Rook's coat. The post behind her groaned, its wooden arms shifting with a slow, patient complaint. Rook dismounted and walked toward her, boots sinking into the dry earth. He did not rush. He did not stop. Sky's hand fell from the crate. Her eyes searched his face, not for answers, but for truth. "You came a long way," she said. "So did you," Rook replied. The space between them held everything they hadn't said on the road, everything they hadn't said in the valley, everything that had pushed them apart in the first place. Rook looked past her, toward the river bend where the land dipped and the water caught the light. "The town's still standing," he said. "So is the ranch." Sky nodded. "And you?" Rook met her gaze. "I left it." She studied him, the lines around his eyes, the dust on his coat, the way he stood like a man who had finally put something down instead of picking something up. Rook took a breath. "I didn't come to bring you back because I owe you. I didn't come because the valley needs you. I came because I do." Sky felt the words settle, not like a promise, but like a door opening. "I don't need you to stay because it's right," Rook went on. "I need you to stay because you want to." The windpost creaked again, turning its wooden arms toward the west, toward the long road that led back to Mercer Valley. Sky looked at it, then back at Rook. All her life, people had told her where she belonged. On one side of a line, on one side of a fence, on one side of a story that wasn't hers to write. She saw now that Rook wasn't standing in front of her as a ranch owner, as a name the town used to keep things in place. He was standing there as a man who had chosen to step out of the shape the world had drawn for him. Sky exhaled, slow and deep. "I didn't leave to find something better," she said. "I left so you wouldn't lose what you had." Rook shook his head. "What I had was empty without you." The words weren't polished. They weren't careful. They were true. Sky felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been held tight since the night she walked away from the porch light and into the dark. She stepped closer. The supply men pretended not to look. The wagons creaked, the river whispered. Sky rested her hand against Rook's coat, not as a test, not as a question, but as a choice. "I won't go back as someone you're protecting," she said. "I'll go back as someone walking beside you." Rook nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes steady. "That's the only way I want you there." They stood for a moment longer, the wind moving around them like it was trying to learn their shapes. Rook led his horse closer. Sky picked up her pack, slung it over her shoulder, the weight familiar and light all at once. They did not look back at the trading post. They did not look at the road ahead. They looked at each other. Then Rook swung into the saddle and reached down. Sky took his hand, her grip firm, and stepped up behind him, settling into the space he made without asking. The windpost turned, pointing toward the valley. Rook nudged his horse forward. The high plain fell away behind them as they started back toward Mercer Valley. Not as a ranch owner and a girl the town whispered about. Not as a man carrying a burden and a woman carrying a debt. But as two people riding the same road, by choice, into a future that would have to learn their names the hard way. They rode back into Mercer Valley at dusk, when the light turned the hills the color of old gold, and the shadows stretched long enough to touch the past. The town did not greet them with cheers. It greeted them with space. Windows held faces that didn't wave. Boots paused on the wooden walk. Conversations softened into half-sentences that drifted away on the wind. The valley was still deciding what these two people were to become. At the open yard near the well, Saul Redding stood at one end, his posture straight, his eyes steady, like a man who had measured many seasons and learned which ones were worth waiting through. At the other end, Preacher Holt rested his hands on the worn cover of his Bible, the lines in his face deepened by a kind of concern that came from wanting peace more than agreement. Between them, the ground lay bare. Nell Boone stepped forward from the doorway of the ranch house and set a loaf of bread on the long table. She didn't say a word. The bread was still warm. Steam lifted from its cracked crust like a quiet welcome. Post-Hale arrived a moment later, his horse flecked with foam, a folded paper in his hand. He passed it to Rook. "Land office made it official," he said. "Your claim stands. The wells, the fences, the valley recognizes Mercer Ranch." Rook nodded. "And the town?" Post glanced around at the watching faces. Still thinking, Rook folded the paper and tucked it into his coat. "They can take their time." The wind moved across the yard, carrying the smell of grass and ash and bread. Somewhere, a gate creaked. Sky Redding stepped forward, her boots finding the center of the open ground. Rook joined her. They did not hold hands yet. They stood side by side, close enough to feel each other's warmth, far enough to show the space they were choosing to cross. There was no preacher's call, no ribboned arch, no line of chairs. Just a circle of stones and a small fire burning low in the middle, its light steady and honest. Saul Redding watched his daughter, his gaze heavy with the weight of letting go and the quiet pride of seeing her stand where she chose. Preacher Holt bowed his head, not in command, but in witness. Skye knelt first. She dipped a tin cup into the well and poured the water into a shallow bowl by the fire. The surface rippled, catching the flame in broken pieces of gold. Rook followed. He scooped a handful of earth from the ground and let it fall through his fingers beside the bowl. The dust darkened where it touched the water, turning into something that could hold shape if given time. They looked at each other then, not like a ranch owner and the girl the town had whispered about, not like a man carrying a valley on his shoulders and a woman carrying a tribe in her heart. Just two people who had walked away from easier paths and found each other waiting on the harder one. Rook reached out. Skye took his hand. They placed their joined hands over the bowl, over the water and the soil, over the small, steady fire that kept burning without asking for permission. Rook spoke, his voice low, meant for her more than the crowd. "I stay," Skye answered just as quietly. "So do I." The wind passed through the circle, lifting Skye's braid, tugging at Rook's coat, like it was testing the shape they made together. No one clapped. No one argued. Nell Boone broke the loaf and passed the first piece to Saul Redding. He took it, hesitated, then nodded once. Preacher Holt accepted the second, his mouth set in a line that was neither smile nor frown, but something close to hope. The town began to move again, slow and uncertain. Some stepped closer. Some stepped away. The valley did what it always did. It watched. Later, when the fire burned down to coals and the stars began to show, Rook and Skye sat on the low fence near the well. The land stretched out before them, quiet and wide and unfinished. "Do you think it will ever be easy?" Skye asked. Rook considered the hills, the fences, the dark line of the river beyond. "No," he said, "but I think it will be ours." Skye leaned against him, not like someone seeking shelter, but like someone choosing a place to stand. The wind kept blowing. The town kept whispering. The tribe kept watching. And on that piece of ground, marked by water and fire and dust, two people began to write a different kind of law. One made not of paper or promises, but of staying when leaving would have been simpler. The valley did not change that night, but it listened.